Hey everyone, getting into a quick Photoshop tutorial. We're going to get some analog lens distortion going, some colorful light leaks, some lo-fi textures to quickly create this vintage toy camera look. Pretty fun to experiment with, also kind of cool when you apply it to images with typography. Let's jump into Photoshop and get started. Alright, I've got an image here to work with, obviously a square image. This is 2160 pixels square. Pretty much everything we're going to look at though works more or less the same no matter what size your image is. If you're working with an image that is not a square, there's just one setting in this tutorial that'll be different, which I will point out in a minute. But we'll get started with part one, the bad lens. I'm going to use two filters to get that cheap plastic lens look. First, I'm going to apply the lens correction filter. And we're not correcting anything, we're actually going to use this filter to degrade the quality of the image. I'm going to switch over from auto correction to custom settings, and this will actually be subtle for now. I'm going to start by bringing the remove distortion value to 1, which actually gives us a little bit of lens distortion. Then in these chromatic aberration settings, I'm dragging the first one all the way down to -100. I'll leave the middle one, then drag the last one all the way up to 100. And if I zoom way in, these settings are actually stretching the red, green, and blue channels a little bit and actually starting to introduce a little bit of chromatic aberration. One more thing in here, I'm going to bring the vignette amount here down to -25, but I'll drag the midpoint all the way up to 100. That's just going to give us a little bit of vignetting on the far corners. And here's the side note, if you're working with images that are not square, like a 4:6 format, you'll want to set this scale value down here to 99%. Otherwise, every time you apply this, it's going to scale your image up a little bit. But for square images, I'll leave that at 100 and hit OK. And the trick here is not just to apply that filter, but to reapply it multiple times. I can use Command-Control-F on a Mac or Command-Alt-F in Windows, and you can see here as I just keep reapplying that filter, I'm getting more and more distortion, more and more separation in the red, green, and blue channels, and that vignette starts to creep in around the edges. Of course, the more times you apply this, the more extreme that effect is going to get. I'm going to go a little bit over the top here. That was probably 15 applications of that filter. One more filter for this lens effect. It's actually a very simple one. I'm going to use the radial blur filter. This is set to zoom, and I'll put in an amount of 10 and bring the quality settings up to best. That's it. And that has the nice effect of blending those separated RGB channels together and creates this nice natural rainbowing effect toward the edges. That brings us to part two, the light and color. Part of the charm of those vintage plastic cameras is that they always end up with light leaks and kind of weird color bleeds. Of course, this is something you could paint in Photoshop, but why paint blobs of color when you could drop in some pre-made blobs of color from the Texturelabs site? All this stuff is free, by the way, and I will link to it below. I'm going to set this color layer to screen mode, and that looks kind of cool. But what I like to do is use a single adjustment on this, a hue saturation adjustment, and just rotate the hue around. Changing the hue of this gives you so many options of how the image looks. Real light leaks tend to be an orangish color, but that doesn't need to be a rule, and I'm kind of liking this turquoise and pink look. Then I'm going to do one overall color adjustment. I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer. Of course, you can get really detailed with color using a curves adjustment. All I'm going to do here is use one of the default settings, the very last one, the strong contrast setting, but I'm going to adjust it a little bit. I'm going to take this point, the second from the top, and just drag it out to get rid of it. Then I'm going to take the white point and pull it down a bit, bringing the output level at that point to about 220, meaning nothing here will ever go pure white, and I think that gives the image a nice high contrast look without looking like we've just cranked up all the whites. Alright, part 3, the fun part, the texture. So pretty much every designer I know has their favorite settings for a film grain layer. I'll show you my go-to settings. I'm going to create a new layer, then use Edit Fill or the shortcut Shift F5 to fill, and fill this with 50% gray. Then I'm going to use the Add Noise filter. I'll set this to 10% Gaussian noise, and that's a little sharp to look like natural grain. I'm also going to use Gaussian blur on this layer, but set it to just 0.5 pixels, just enough to blend it together a little bit. Then I'm going to set this layer to overlay mode, and you can kind of eyeball how much grain you want. I'm going to go for a nice even 50% opacity here. Then for some dust and fingerprints, nothing beats a nice dust and fingerprints texture. I will also link to this texture below. I'm going to drag this on top and I will set it to linear dodge mode. Screen could also work and be a little bit more subtle. Linear dodge almost makes those dust bits kind of glow against the image. It's nice that the curves adjustment limited any whites below to never going pure white, because now I'm getting dust showing up in the whites here too, which is kind of nice. And linear dodge is one of the special 8 blending modes, meaning fill and opacity do 2 different things. I do recommend trying to commit those special 8 blending modes to memory. Bringing back the fill almost always looks more natural than bringing down the opacity, so I'm just eyeballing this and making it a touch more subtle with the fill at about 75%. Then, like I mentioned, working with textures is kind of the fun part, the experimental part. Let's go ahead and add another texture. There are a handful of these photo edge kind of textures on the Texturelabs site to experiment with. They tend to work well with screen and multiply modes as kind of the jumping off point. I'll set this one to screen mode. And why not one more, maybe a border texture to give the whole thing kind of an uneven edge. I'll set this one to multiply mode. And there we have it. Timmy and his camera just got about 40 years older. I hope you guys will enjoy pushing around some of these ideas and these textures. If so, please do me the quick favor of hitting the like button. Be sure to subscribe for more Texturelabs content. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.